All right, we are live. My name is Corinne Straight. This is Plots and Politics, and this is a special edition of Plots and Politics. And I'm going to call it like the 4P edition, and we can totally revise that as we go forward if it's a name that sucks. So this is going to be Plots and Politics Policy Perspectives. And I am really excited to start bringing in some Indiana lawmakers and have them share their side of a certain policy issue, work that they are doing on this issue in Indianapolis, and really just kind of try to broaden the work that these folks do down in Indy for their constituents. My very first guest on Plots and Politics Policy Perspectives, I need to make up some logo. It's just like a bunch of P's because there's so many P's here. My very first guest, I'm very excited to have her. Her name is Representative Maureen Bauer. She represents District 6, which is up here in my neck of the woods in northern Indiana. So without further ado, Representative Maureen Bauer, welcome to the show.
Hi, thank you so much. Thank you for having me.
This is my inaugural dive into this policy side, and I'm hoping that this is something that will catch people's interests. I know on social media, you and your colleagues do a really good job of getting some videos out and content out, and people really seem to enjoy kind of the nerdy breakdowns, even if it's just a couple minutes long, the nerdy breakdown of a policy issue. So before we dive into that, can you tell us a little bit about District 6, the people that you represent?
Of course. So I am in my third term as state representative of House District 6, which is in St. Joseph County, and it includes downtown South Bend, large portion of the city from east-west. It goes all the way to Washington High School on the west, and then south of Notre Dame campus, and just up to that Eddie Cummins and McKinley school area.
Okay.
And a little bit of Mishawaka since the redistricting.
So you get some Mishawaka now. Yes.
Yeah.
So your district does not include the university, correct?
It does not. No. It used to way back when.
Back when.
Yeah.
That's been cut out. So what are the predominant industries in the 6th district? What are most people doing for work?
Yeah. Well, a lot of people do work at the University of Notre Dame, but live in the district, have either downtown or near Adams High School. I have all the high schools now that Clay has closed. We also have Beacon Hospital as a major employer in the area as well. And so those probably the top two in the district.
The university and the hospital.
Yeah.
So I just wanted to kind of give that overview. So if other folks around the state listen, Maureen Bauer is a Democratic representative. And so that kind of gives us an idea of what that district looks like, primarily being a big chunk of a city. And you are one of, I think we've got 3 Democrats up here in the St. Joe County area in the Senate, and then another one in the House. Long time. They've both been in there, I feel like forever, Dvorak and Niskotsky. I wanted to jump in to the policy that we're going to look at today. And this is not a legislative policy, but an executive order. And on the national level, we have definitely seen a flurry of executive order activity coming out of the Trump administration. But that is also a power that a governor has as an executive of a state. And so we are seeing very similar executive action being taken here in Indiana. Braun signed a bunch of executive orders relating to, trans women in sports, relating to releasing of TPRs, these terminated pregnancy records. He rescinded state employees' abilities to work from home 2 days a week. So, there was a whole bunch of ink was running dry, I'm sure, out of all those pens. And just last week, we got another one because it almost feels like, okay, maybe we're done with the executive orders for a while. But no, we got another one last week specifically related to environmental regulations. So Representative Bauer, can you tell us a little bit about that executive order?
Yeah, he actually dropped 2 in the same day. One was on environmental policy. One was declaring a no more stringent than rule, which we already have in the state of Indiana. I don't think it benefits the state of Indiana, but what it says is that the legislature can't pass a more stringent than piece of legislation than what is currently federal law. So when we want to regulate, I'll use an example. I would say PFAS in drinking water or lead in drinking water. Those are challenging areas for us because it tends to be a no more stringent than rule.
Mhm.
We saw kind of similar legislation, which takes away locals' authority to pass a more stringent than law than state. And so, what we're really doing is looking at Washington, D.C. to write our environmental policy, which, in my opinion, is not what the traditional Republican Party has been advocating for. They usually are the party of local control. And
Mhm.
so, my response to that executive order was, why are we letting Washington, D.C. dictate clean air, clean water, and environmental policy for us? Mike Braun used to be a House representative,
Mhm.
and I thought he understood the power of the legislature, which is separate but equal from the executive branch, and that we go home every weekend when we're in session. We live in our districts when we aren't at the state house during the session, which is January through March, or this year is January through April in a budget year. We have conversations with individuals who live and work there. And so I believe the legislature knows what's best for our communities, especially when it comes to environmental policy, which is directly a reflection on our health.
Mhm.
We don't have clean water to drink. If we don't have clean air to breathe, we suffer either with asthma diagnoses or if we know the dangers of lead in drinking water for children. And so while that executive order didn't really do anything effective, it was setting a clear statement that his administration is going to turn to DC to write our environmental policies, and that he is going to imitate what the Trump administration is doing with these flurry of executive orders.
And the timing of it was kind of interesting because that was it was either the day of or the day after the new EPA director released kind of a long line of directives of here's what the EPA will do and will not do anymore. And can you talk a little bit about this idea of, and maybe this has just been all marketing, right? That environmental regulations are stifling the business community, that it's too burdensome, because that seemed to be kind of at least the vein of how Braun was going about it, like these burdensome regulations, how the EPA director spoke about it. So can you talk a little bit of just about that balance?
Yeah, we have a lot of home builders in our Indiana General Assembly, and they tend to drive environmental policy. So we often aren't thinking of preserving wetlands. We have, since I've been in the General Assembly in 2020, each year stripped away protections from wetlands. And it has been a priority policy of the Indiana Home Builder Association. And they are boldly taking credit for that. That is a driving force. I get their newsletter, and I got a thank you on the front of the newsletter, thanking all the legislators who stripped away those wetland protections.
Wow.
Um,
Well, that's depressing.
they gotta take me off their mail list. But
Uh-huh.
the interesting thing is, in our position of lawmakers, we're always trying to find the median, right,
Mhm.
between environmental policy and responsible growth. That's always the discussion. But when we have it too heavy on one side or the other, even if we are over regulating where we are preserving lands that can't be developed, which isn't a concern in Indiana, but we have to find the middle ground where we aren't disrupting those natural habitats for species that aren't going to have flooding problems down the road, or even for farmers, downstream, that they're going to be a direct result in the downstream of the implications of people who aren't either. We know we have a lot of point source pollution in the state of Indiana that's runoff from farms. We are afraid to address that.
Mhm.
I will say in the executive order, Braun did mention that as a concern. So maybe we have an inroad there and we could
Yep.
balance farming with environmental health. But when it comes to development, and there was a bill that moved out of the House already and is in the Senate, but it changes. the permit for construction sites, that
Mhm.
you cannot set a more stringent standard at the local level, which is
Yep.
where those decisions should be made, that you have to abide by the state rules and regulations. So,
And that's really frustrating. As somebody that I spent a lot of time working in local government, and I was actually on the stormwater board for our city, and and all of what we did was managing construction sites and runoff, to
yeah,
protect the water table and protect stormwater and drainage. And when you have such a diverse, I mean, Indiana doesn't feel like a diverse landscape, but it really is when you look at manufacturing and densely populated urban areas all the way out to incredibly rural areas with
right.
just a bunch of farmland. Those are incredibly different ecosystems that need incredibly different types of environmental protections.
Absolutely. And I think when we look at other states, it's been farmers who led some of the policy reform in these areas, because you have to have healthy soil to have
Yeah.
healthy harvests. And so if you are doing regenerative farming, I'm a grape grower outside of the legislature. So
Oh,
I
how
kind of
exciting.
work in this realm with others who, sustainability isn't a four-letter word. It is making sure your crop is healthy. And so
Yeah.
that is the livelihood of your family, in many cases. So I'm hopeful that in the future we can find more allies with the farming community, conservation community, and those conservatives who believe that conservation environmental policy is a conservative value, because
Mhm.
so often it feels a partisan subject when
And
we all should want to afford
mhm.
drinking water that is clean and air that is pollutant free. That should
Right?
be the standard.
That shouldn't that we should there shouldn't be no party affiliation to clean water or clean air. And you touched on something earlier that I wanted to go back to, and that is the makeup of the folks that are in the legislature. And this is something that I looking at different state legislatures, and Indiana is part-time. We have a full-time in Michigan. And I've always laughed that Indiana is called a part-time legislature because I know how much y'all work. And even though the session is only 3 or 4 months long, like you've got summer committees and fall committees,
Right.
and you're always on duty when you're back home in your districts too. So I think part-time is kind of a misnomer. But when you look at the makeup of a legislature, and when it's a part-time legislature, that means you're not getting a full-time salary. So you
Mhm.
have to be able to supplement your income somehow. And that to me has always really narrowed the availability of who can even decide to run for the legislature. So when you have people in construction, there are so many entrepreneurs, lawyers, doctors,
Mhm.
people who are running their own businesses who can easily step away anytime they need to.
Right.
So how does that shape policy when those are the voices down there? If we have, very industry specific voices.
Yeah. So my dad served before me. He was a teacher, and we have very few teachers anymore because it's so hard to balance that schedule. You are leaving the classroom for months at a time. I've known, I mean, there are many retired members of the legislature
Mhm.
now. There's a lot of consultants, and um, they have to be very transparent about who they have contracts with in terms of conflicts of interest. So there are very few farmers anymore. So you kind of get, we have some lawyers, but you get a certain subset of individuals where we have, gosh, over a dozen of these home builders. And
Mhm.
the idea is that we are a citizen legislature. We bring something to the table with our experience and our background. Um, but in some of these instances, maybe we should abstain from voting if you're going to vote on a policy that will allow, destruction of wetlands so more homes can be built on wetland area.
Mhm.
Maybe you shouldn't be the one voting on that issue. And that is also why summer study committees are so important, because we can bring in those experts. I was on the drainage task force, and we were trying to look at some of these issues about farming and sustainability, and we had local surveyors on the
Oh yeah.
committee, and we ended up making it was one of them. The Senator Lysing said it was the worst summer study committee she's ever been a part of, because we made no recommendations, but it was the
Uh-huh.
local surveyors who were telling the state legislators who wanted to push this legislation
Mhm.
through. They had an agenda they were trying to meet, and they just flat out said, "This isn't what we would do as local surveyors." So
Yeah.
I thought it was great because they were probably all the same party, but they differed in view because of that local perspective. That's so
Hmm.
important. So a lot of the legislators now have also served on city councils, and
Yeah.
when they take away that power from that local unit of government, it's almost they're turning their back on that role they used to serve. So we see a lot of the city and town versus state legislature, where now with this executive order and others, where they're just deferring to DC to write some of our laws for us. So
Which is really concerning, especially being, representing the area that you do. And I'm really thinking of um, the potential negative consequences of some kind of relaxation of environmental oversight or regulations. I'm not saying that that is what's happening yet, but I in a lot of my content, I remind folks who are new to looking at policy and new at looking at how policy is written, that a lot of times it's a value statement. It's
mhm,
not the goal of a piece of legislation is not only to create a law, it's to express the values of the body that is creating it. And so
mhm,
when you hear this coming out of the governor's office, it is a little concerning. And I think of, in the South Bend area, we've got the Great Lakes Basin, that is,
mhm.
to be stewards of the Great Lakes, the dunes, and then to have just a few miles to the west, a major oil refinery. I mean, there are just the potential disastrous consequences of any
Yeah.
kind of relaxation. It just, when you look at the magnitude of it, especially the concentration in this area.
Yeah, I mean, we are south of the bend of the St. Joe River. It's how we got our name, and we faced some serious wastewater issues, and we were under a consent decree to get up to standard. Um, but we are at a major tributary that goes into the Lake Michigan. It goes, I mean, just if we look at individuals who serve on the St. Joe River Basin, those are the experts we should be listening to when we make
Yeah.
some of these policies. Um, I did also want to make sure we discussed the other executive order,
Yes. Yeah. Let's go on to the other one. Yep.
which was said that there should be no decisions about environmental justice
Mm.
when making policy, which,
Ooh, explain that. Tell us what environmental justice is.
well, I mean, taking a cue out of Pete Buttigieg's recent conversation when he was talking about DEI, the opposite of justice is injustice.
Mm, mm,
So, what are we promoting here? What is the messaging that's being sent out to individuals in our state? Now, when I think of justice, I think it's righting the wrongs that we made a mistake on in the past. And we
mhm.
don't have to feel bad for it and think that's why some individuals don't like some of these justice initiatives. It makes them feel blame for years of pollution or dumping. We have some sites in South Bend that are, on the Superfund site with
Yeah.
EPA, and we work closely with the federal government and had funding from IDEM and other state agencies to clean up years of legacy pollution at
Mhm.
Beck's Lake, known as the lake in South Bend on the west side. And for years, kids would play in that dirt and that swim in that lake, and it was contaminated. And so once we figured out that this illegal dumping by industry was harming the neighborhood and the
Yeah.
individuals who lived and played there, we had to make it right. And so
Mhm.
that's an example of us fixing something. And I would argue that is environmental justice. And it is a priority of anyone who's representing that area. Um, I, the state of Indiana, probably the most environmental justice projects are in white rural neighborhoods.
Yeah.
So I can't quite wrap my head around making this decision. He said that any environmental policy should be driven by science, and I agree. And so if
100%.
if we're
Then
gonna
let's stick to that.
exactly, this is politics. This is
Mhm.
pandering to your base, and I think it is doing a disservice when we send a message out like that.
It really is. And I mean, you mentioned Superfund sites. I mean, anybody can go, which I haven't checked it in a while because we know there are some links that are disappearing to some of our federal websites. But you can check out, the EPA Superfund designations and a brownfield designation and see what we're dealing with in Indiana. And, Elkhart County, where I am, and St. Joe County are very similar in the manufacturing legacy.
Mhm.
And, and we did a lot of that, I did a lot of that work when I was at the city too, of just okay, we can build here, but we got 15 years of remediation. We've got all this because for how many decades and decades did people just dump everything into the ground and into the river? And so the justice is yeah, let's go back and fix that. There are long-term consequences. If we believed in the 1920s that we dumped a bucket of solvent in the river and then it just
Right.
disappeared,
Right.
obviously we were wrong. Okay. I always say, I'm like, doctors also told pregnant women to smoke, like for their nerves. So like we cannot
We learned.
rely
We
on,
learned.
we
We can
cannot
admit when we
rely.
were wrong. That's a
Yes.
very important part of
Admit
growing
when we
up.
were wrong. And
Leadership. Yeah.
the idea that justice or righting wrongs from the past is a bad thing. Is that really where we are?
Right. And I think it's a really important message now when we're seeing large industry moving into Indiana. New Carlisle with the Amazon project. We're going to have chip manufacturing. We have a lot of battery projects, EV battery projects popping up. And now that we know that there is potential for runoff or there is other uh, possibilities that we need to put into place to protect our drinking water, to protect the ditches and the dams. We have local level, some permitting that's coming through where the county council is going to have to either allow industry to reroute wetlands or rebuild wetlands. And
Mhm.
we're at a critical point of growth, which is wonderful. We're going to create jobs that will transform futures, in my
Mhm.
opinion. But we do need to be responsible and make sure that we won't be coming back in 30, 40, 50 years and saying we messed up. We contaminated your ground and drinking water. So we do have to learn from the mistakes of our past.
And it's interesting. This is another time I was doing a lot of digging into the new data centers coming into St. Joe County. And, the St. Joe County Council, approved a pretty substantial agreement with Amazon, which is wonderful. It was a big economic development incentive. And now residents are learning that wetlands are
Right.
potentially threatened and will be filled in, about 9 acres of wetlands. And I know a bunch of people have been submitting public comments. So great job.
Mhm.
They do listen to y'all. I know sometimes it feels like that they don't, but these regulatory agencies, especially IDEM, the Indiana Department of Environmental Management, that's their job to protect the environment. And it does seem like we are kind of at a new frontier a bit with
Mhm.
where industry, mainly technology companies needing these data centers, are so far outpacing the pace of our legislation.
Right.
How do we make sure that we're not in 10 years from now saying, "Oh my gosh, we totally didn't see this coming." And now we have millions of dollars of cleanup to do. How do we balance that?
Yeah. Well, I would say not letting Washington, D.C. write those policies,
Seems like a no-brainer.
giving the power, empowering the legislature to pass policies to specifically promote good policy in our state and giving the local authorities the permission to make more stringent policies that
Mhm.
suit the growth and development. That's that delicate balance that we're talking about, and that often the local governments know best. And so, um, local control.
Local control, which is what Republicans told us they've wanted for all this
Yeah.
time.
Yeah.
And I want to talk logistics for a second on just balance of power. So Governor Braun put out this executive order. What kind of power does that hold? If the legislature had, a bill kind of working through that was contrary to that executive order, would
Mhm.
it just be abandoned? Would it be null? How does that say it got passed? Could he just not sign it? And then, so how does that balance of power work?
Yeah. I mean, like I said, we're separate but equal. So we still get the authority to write legislation and he has to sign and approve it. And he does have veto power, but there's a super majority in the House and Senate. So we have a veto override in the legislature. It's been interesting when it's been used because, of course, the governor's office is Republican and so is the Indiana General Assembly. And we saw that happening, I think, probably every year I was there was a veto
Mhm.
override on something.
Yeah.
Um, so I struggle with the weight of an executive order. it does limit, to certain population of people, like we saw with others regarding bereavement leave, just impacts state
Yeah.
employees. And as I said, we already have a no more stringent than language. We aren't really proactive as a General Assembly in passing progressive environmental policies. I will note there was a time when we were leaders in this area.
Mhm.
When the first wetland protection language went in, it was studied very, it was gone to summer study committee for probably 2 summers or 3 summers in a row. It was bipartisan. Um, they recognize the value in preserving our natural resources. That
Mhm.
is something that attracts people to our state for tourism, quality of life. You have trails and hiking paths and wildlife. And so when we go back to those battles that we had about the wetlands, we had a remarkable group of allies from conservation organizations to trappers and hunters
Mhm.
who wanted to ensure that they still had these natural resources and habitats in our state, and that we wouldn't be rerouting those with bad policy. So I guess only time will tell to see if this has any influence on the legislature, but I think that we kind of have restricted the authority of the legislative body in the past with these no more stringent than rules. So.
And with that already being in place, it almost just seems like a press opportunity, or just some PR opportunity to sign this executive order and virtue signal to those in power in Washington, like, look what we're doing in Indiana.
Yeah.
And there's definitely other pieces of legislation that feel that way too.
Right, completely. And it's interesting that he chose to do two with that environmental justice
Mhm.
piece. So,
Yeah, and that really just feels like a buzzword.
yeah.
And I think this does open up an opportunity to maybe do a little more educating on the legacy of old manufacturing, and different steps of cleanup, and why this is important. And I mean, we could even look at air quality studies in Indiana over the last 40 to 50 years, and how much our air quality has improved. And
Mhm.
it's not on accident. And I think sometimes there's a disconnect. Maybe we don't recognize what we lose until it's gone. But if this has been something we've taken for granted, clean air, clean water, what world is there when that's no longer a guaranteed protection, when that's not a default?
Yeah, and I mean, we constantly talk about how dysfunctional DC is, how slow they are to move. That's why we have the authority at the state level to pass policies that
Mhm.
we know our state agencies can enforce. I think about PFAS, which we've made some progress on in the
Yeah.
state of Indiana. But where we have the most contamination are military bases and airports, and that impacts firefighters. And so these are, you would think, groups of people we can all get behind and support, saying you deserve a safe working environment. You shouldn't worry about cancer or other causes that can impact your health simply because of where you work
Yeah,
or
and
your.
necessary work that we all need you to do.
Completely. And as we learn more about the impacts of PFAS to our first responders, we act. And so
Mhm.
I think we should not tie our hands from learning about these real life situations and having the authority and the ability to act as quickly as possible.
And I wanted to touch, as when we can wrap up here in just a few minutes. I want to give people some action steps, and I wanted to highlight something that I heard you mention in committee earlier this week. And I always tell people, like, I'm watching committee hearings, so you don't have to. So you're welcome. It's usually like I had what I think I was listening to Senate appropriations, like, while I was doing my makeup, like, just listening in case I needed to, like, record something.
That's a
Um,
service. That's public service right there.
it really is. Um, but in the Medicaid
Right.
hearing, I believe it was the Medicaid hearing. Is that when you mentioned Logan,
Yeah.
the Logan Center?
Yeah.
And so
Senate
if,
Bill
if
2.
Senate Bill 2. If y'all aren't familiar, that is Senate Bill 2 is working its way through the House now. It was in front of the Public Health Committee earlier this week. And what Representative Bauer did was mention something that a constituent had told her. And so I just want, if you could give us a recap there, because I just want to highlight that you all do take in this information.
Absolutely. I mean, there's some legislators I hear won't meet with anyone unless they live in their district, but I think it shows the power of the people, right? And so
Yeah.
reaching out to your elected officials, we are beholden to you. And when we're at that legislature or during session, when we're in those seats, we are your voice. And that's what we tell you during the election time. But it's so important not just to be engaged during elections, but when they're writing these policies that will impact you, your family, your future.
Mm-hmm.
You know, we often have to convince people to get into politics because it's kind of a buzzword, but it is about you. It's about your future. It decides if you're going to live in Indiana anymore, decides if you're going to be able to have children and work at the same time. And so um, what you're talking about was a constituent who works at Logan Center, who is one of the few facilities in the state that provides autism care and
Mm-hmm.
helps individuals with disabilities. And they largely fundraise on their own. They have incredible fundraising capacity, but they do serve a large Medicaid population who can't work, maybe don't go to traditional school and have someone taking care of them all day. But there was a part of that legislation that prohibits the advertising or marketing of Medicaid services.
Mm-hmm.
And that would essentially prohibit this organization from even telling people these services are available.
Yeah.
And even when they largely are dependent of state government funding, they
Mm-hmm.
will still have to be under this control of the
Yeah.
state legislature and state government from being able to share what services they provide. And so the author of the Senate Bill 2 also serves portion of St. Joseph County, Ryan Mishler, and I shared with him their concern. And the author said he hadn't spoken to anyone from that organization. I will state he was at the third House meeting, which
Yeah.
Senator Mishler wasn't able to attend. And that's where it was brought to my attention that there should be an amendment to fix that language.
Yeah.
And I'm still hopeful that we will fix that.
That
But
you can get that. Yeah.
those conversations, being your voice in committee and sharing that I've spoken to someone and giving those examples, real life in the district,
Mm-hmm.
are probably the most impactful for me when debating policies. So,
And
and
especially when it comes to healthcare, I know that that Medicaid hearing was, it was definitely emotional at times with some of the testimony that was shared. And I think of just, I mean, gosh, think of every single streaming show that you watch and the 9 million like pharmaceutical commercials that come
yeah,
on. Like, I always laugh. I'm just like, what demographic do they think I am that I'm getting this ad? Like, this drug is being marketed to me. But you think of all the kind of medical advertising that is out there, like things that you're like, oh, I remember when I first, I'm not old enough yet, but when I first learned that the shingles shot was a thing, like, oh, that
sure.
was marketing. That was marketed to me. Now it was by private healthcare, I'm sure, by a private insurer
Yeah.
or a private drug developer. But for someone to even just say, this is what we have to offer, just to not be able to say that seemed like a really kind of silly
Yeah.
restriction.
Well, and the initial fear was, is it specifically to reduce enrollment?
That's how it feels. Yeah.
And there was
Yep.
someone who testified saying, he's from a national think tank, came in to testify in favor of the bill, doesn't live in our community, doesn't work in our
Yeah.
community, goes around to different states trying to pass these Medicaid reform bills. And he said that enrollment is the driving cost of Medicaid. Well, sure, we're
Yep.
serving more people, we're going to be spending more money.
Yeah.
Turns out that administrative fees are very costly. We only paid about $667 per person for coverage, and so I would be
Which
very
seems
careful.
reasonable.
Yeah, I'd be very careful when we're doing this to limit access to healthcare. When I think it's pretty clear that um, we should do all we can to make sure people have the care they need. Again, that's preventative, like
Yeah.
drinking clean drinking water is preventative for your
It
health, and
all
so.
goes together. And you also did a good job of in that hearing of bringing up, um, when people don't have access to preventative care, they ultimately end up in the ER. They end up in our hospitals. They end up in a situation where the care is much more expensive.
You have to wait until there's an emergency. They
Yeah,
aren't taking care of their health. They're not doing those cancer screenings, as we heard many people say.
mhm,
They can't afford the colonoscopy that you're supposed to get at a certain age every few years. So
yeah,
you're letting that go to the wayside. Um, we um, we saw policy pass during the Holcomb administration that gave funding to local health departments, and we
mhm,
heard from the secretary Weaver, who stated the impact to the state bottom line that all
yeah,
this preventative care and spending it at the local level, surveying the community, the county, and figuring out where our values are. Is it
mhm,
smoking cessation? Is it addressing infant and maternal mortality? What is it that's important to us? And you can spend that money any way you want to. And at first, not every county opted in. And at the end, all 92 counties did, because you can use it to just educate individuals about services in the community.
yeah,
So,
just tell them
um,
what's available, yeah,
yeah. And so that money may not be coming back. So now we have to, in some other way, make sure we're still promoting healthy communities, and
mhm.
that public
And
health
that
is important.
local control is what I remember, that they launched a specific diabetes nutrition kind of program up here in Elkhart County where I live. And that was in response, and this was several years ago, but it was in response to a weird uptick in
Right.
diabetes type 2 like diagnoses that they had been seeing. And the health director of our health department at the time was like, it's probably age court, our population's getting older, we're kind of seeing a bump, and here's a way that we can use those funds that maybe 5 years ago we would have used it for smoking cessation, but at this
Right.
point in time we're going to tackle diabetes, and that is different than maybe what St. Joe County needed or
Mhm.
Vanderburgh County needed, and they could tailor it to their people.
Right. And I think another comment that was made during that committee hearing was that, public service announcements used to be something of value to
Yes.
government services. And I remember as a kid, even like companies, you teach you that floating light bulb that would tell you not to put a fork in the outlet,
Yeah.
and certain commercials that were tailored to kids, or like
Yep.
the poison sticker on
A
bottles.
poison stick. Was that Mr. Yuck? Right? Was that Mr. Yuck?
Yeah.
I think it was. Yeah. Uh huh.
And you see it now with in other states like Michigan. We're so close to the border. They have billboards about keeping handguns out of the hands of children and how you
Hmm.
safely store handguns. So public education is a good thing, especially when it relates to direct values where we can see impacts to health and safety. So
And it is interesting. I look at like coming from like a marketing and communications lens is when marketing and advertising is seen as frivolous, it's seen like,
Mhm.
oh, this is an extra that we don't need to spend. That vacuum is filled with private advertising then, and that's where you see, especially in the political world, you see so much of the PAC and super PAC and special interest funding going into advertising. I mean, there's already social media campaigns by special interest groups supporting an agenda that are worth like hundreds and hundreds of thousands of dollars going on as soon as the election ended after in November. And so it's like when the government can't spend, when you can't spend and say, here's what I'm doing here, then you're kind of you there's no competition for them to fill
Right.
that void with a very tailored message.
Or like you said, pharmaceutical industry will
Yeah.
flood the airwaves because that's pretty lax. Another part of that legislation, which we're hoping will change, is also says state agencies can't promote Medicaid. So then we think who that is. I mean, could it be fall down to like elected officials, school corporations, libraries? When you look at that definition of state agencies, it's
Hmm.
a sweeping change. So
That
we're
would be a
hopeful that will be amended in ways and means. And that's when you got to contact your legislators, you got to contact the chairman and vice chairman of the committees and express your concerns. And it is really impactful when you're reaching out to your own legislator. But if you do that regularly and you want to know what else you can do, that's when you can turn your direction to the chairs of the committees who will be soon hearing those bills.
Thank you. I'm so glad you mentioned that. And if you want to find out who your legislator is, because I get that question a lot, go to iga.in.gov. And there are two phone numbers that the one's going to take you to the Senate switchboard, one's going to take you to the House switchboard. So go ahead and call them both. And then you can get directly in contact with staff in their offices. And how, I guess, Maureen, when your staff is handling calls, like how does that work? Are they tallying? Like, is it like a yays and nays of people calling when you're reviewing certain legislation? How does that
Yeah,
work? How does that information get to you?
pretty much. It gets kind of funneled into the bill number and then who supports and who opposes. We also track if it's in district or not,
Okay.
because there's a lot of calls to action. When Senate Bill 2 is being heard, the phone was nonstop.
Yes.
Not a lot of other work got done that day by my legislative assistant, but those numbers count. And I often also, some of my suggestions is maybe focus on the people you think that you need to flip their vote. If you know you already have someone in your corner, maybe don't spend a lot of your time or energy contacting them or their office because
Hmm.
they're already on your side. I think of that with like public education issues a lot.
Yeah.
Although they'll meet with me and I'll kind of give them motivating pep talk before they go on to their next meeting. But often knowing where that legislator lies on the issue, or even asking when you call, hey, does this representative support or oppose this bill? They might be able to tell you if they have a public opinion already that's
Hmm.
been expressed, and then you can know where your time can be best spent too.
That's good to know. Good to know. And the committee, yeah, whoever is in charge of these committees, you can also find that on the website. And the SB2, which is the Medicaid bill, did pass out of public health. And it does have to go to Ways and Means because it is a budget
Yeah.
item as well. So I want to thank you so much, Representative
Thank
Bauer.
you.
This has been a great conversation. And you were my inaugural legislator. You'll always have that title.
Ours
You were
set
the
high.
first one. I've already had a conversation too with one of your colleagues on the Senate side with Senator J.D. Ford
Good.
down from the central Indiana area. And he said he would be happy to be guinea pig number 2. So
Okay.
then we can get the perspective of the Senate and kind of see some things that he's working on as well.
Yes.
But if y'all are listening to this, what questions do you have? What follow-ups do you have? If this was helpful, not helpful, let me know. Either way, we're going to keep tailoring this content. I want to keep getting this message of Indiana's legislative process out there so we all can stay involved and informed. So I really appreciate your time, Representative Bauer. And
Thank
are you
you.
driving home now?
Gotta hit the road. Yep.
All
Headed
right, time to hit the road.
out
Well, safe
then.
driving.
Thank
It
you.
sucks that it was like 70 degrees yesterday and now it's like 30. So it's
All
snowing.
spring.
So welcome back up to Northern Indiana where it's snowing. We'll welcome you back home. And you have safe travels. And thank you so much for your time.
Thank you. This is great. I appreciate all you do to keep our communities informed, engaged, and uh, thank you. This is
Of
awesome.
course. I have so much fun talking about this stuff, and I'm glad other people could appreciate it.
Yes. Anytime. Reach out. Thank you, guys.
Thank you.